Well, welcome everybody. My name's Ben Connolly, and I have the joy to introduce our speaker today, Monica Reede. Monica is a longtime Zen Center member, around 20 years, give or take a little bit. And, Monica moved to Ojai, California several years ago, so then we didn't get to see her. But now through the magic of Zoom, we've been able to reconnect in community. So it's really nice to have been able to have Monica around. Monica was a board president for MZMC several years ago. And I can't even begin to count the number of morning study groups, practice periods, and sessions I personally have shared with Monica joyfully. So it's wonderful to have you here to share with us, and I will turn it over to you, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for being here. It is a pleasure to be able to reconnect with MZMC and to practice with all of you again. So when I was asked if I wanted to give a talk, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and I decided to talk about healing ourselves and healing the world. And it's a big topic, and it's one that it's on our minds right now, and a lot of people have been talking about this. So this is just my moment of contribution to the conversation. These are my thoughts at this moment in time, and so I hope that they, maybe stir something in you, some conversation. So a few weeks ago, my local Sangha, the Santa Barbara Zen Center, was exploring householder koans. These are sometimes called natural koans or personal koans. A householder koan is a question that arises from our own life experience. In the book Householder Koans by Roshis Yves Mion and Marco and Agyoko Nakao, they write, "A life situation becomes a koan when it has jolted you out of your usual linear way of thinking, out of the dualistic observer-observed modality that we're so conditioned to use. It becomes koan practice when you no longer think about the situation, but instead close the gap between subject and object, between yourself and what you're facing. Can we reach beyond what we already know, trusting and radically accepting the life we're given, calling nothing right or wrong, fair or unfair, appreciating the uniqueness of each moment of the situation as a blessing to penetrate and finally even appreciate." So I sat with this invitation to find my own householder koan. And the question that kept coming up for me, and that I realized that I'd been thinking about for a long time, is what is true healing? So that I arrived at this question may seem obvious to those who know that I currently make my living as a holistic healer. In my practice, I facilitate healing using a variety of tools, including hands-on bodywork, somatic psychotherapy, and Buddhist psychology, including mindfulness and meditation techniques. I work with people who are going through both emotional and physical challenges. But I wasn't always called to be a healer. For most of my adult life, I was an artist, and I was happy with that life. I came to healing only because I was in deep need of it myself. So while I'm still sitting with this koan, and I probably will be for the rest of my life, I'd like to share a few things that I've found helpful for myself and for others. But first, I want to give you a little bit of background. Like many, I came to Zen practice because I was suffering. I had developed some pretty good strategies for hiding it, but inside I was pretty much a mess. And in my mid-20s, I read an article on the Four Noble Truths. And when I read that the first noble truth says that everyone's life contains suffering, I felt just a huge sense of relief. For the first time, I was told that I was suffering not because something was wrong with me, but simply because I was a human being living on this planet. That was a revelation. I also saw that the third noble truth said that there's a way out of suffering, and I wanted that. So I took an intro class at the Zen Center and I began to practice. But it wasn't easy. Even the simple instructions to focus on my breath caused me too much anxiety to tolerate. And focusing on different sensations in my body could cause me to literally pass out. Later, I would learn how our bodies hold implicit memories of past traumas, and all this would make sense, but at the time I was just perplexed. But I was also determined, so I just continued to sit and to seek the advice of more experienced practitioners and teachers. I sat as the pain of past wounds surfaced in my consciousness, and I sat as the even more painful realizations of how I had hurt others also arose. As I learned to bring patience and compassion to myself and to this process, there were also moments of peace and a calm that I've never really known before. Things began to shift in my life off the cushion too. I found myself less reactive and more joyful. I devoted myself to practice and study, and I learned some valuable and transformative things. I was even asked to teach some classes and give talks. I can honestly say that Zen practice changed my life. But I also could sense that there was something deep inside that I wasn't reaching, something that was resisting my awareness. And then I got sick. I was about 10 years into my practice when I was diagnosed with first one and then another autoimmune disease. Now, being told that you have a disease with no known cause, no known cure, that no one can see, and that's potentially fatal is something of a Zen koan of itself. How can you be sick and not sick at the same time? But I wasn't very Zen about it. I was angry. Hadn't I done everything right? I meditated, I was a vegetarian, I did yoga, check, check, check. I checked off all the boxes for how to live a healthy life. And this wasn't supposed to be happening to me. Eventually, I came to accept the reality of my situation, but I still wasn't satisfied with the options that I was given. So I began a decades-long investigation into alternative healing that would later give rise to the desire to become the healer that I had wished I had had. Someone who could connect the dots between physical, emotional, and spiritual healing. Ironically, it wasn't until I fully surrendered to my condition and gave up the need to be fixed that my health really began to improve. So one of the first insights I had into true healing is that it isn't about being restored to some previous condition. Because whether we're aware of it or not, those previous causes and conditions were what gave rise to our illness in the first place. I won't go into all the methods and modalities that I explored, especially as they relate to physical illness, because everyone's situation is different and therefore requires unique strategies. But there are a few approaches that I found to be helpful for meeting life's challenges, particularly in this time of great change, when everything seems to be falling apart. The first, of course, is our practice, just sitting with what is. Shikantaza. Making space to bring non-judgmental awareness to whatever is coming up, whether it's arising from internal or external circumstances. Most often it includes both. In Zen, we don't generally use the word healing. Instead, we focus on the relief of suffering. And I would say that my second insight into true healing is that it has more to do with the relief of suffering than the alleviation of symptoms. When we focus only on the symptoms, we tend to miss the underlying causes and conditions that gave rise to those symptoms. To attend to the suffering is to open ourselves up to ways of healing that perhaps were previously unknown. And in the process, we often find that the symptoms abate as well. In the classic instructions for meditation, we're asked to notice whatever's arising and allow it to go, returning again and again to the present moment. This can be a necessary strategy for enabling our reactivity to subside and for giving ourselves moments of peace in stressful times. This is not an indulgence. We need these breaks to balance our energies, just as we need sleep to enable us to function well during our waking hours. However, as we know, sitting practice isn't always calm and peaceful, and other times zazen alone is not enough. As Andrea Martin said recently in one of her talks to the Sangha, this practice is necessary but not always sufficient for our current circumstances. So another approach that I use that blends Western psychology and Buddhist teachings comes from mindfulness meditation teacher and therapist Tara Brach. It's what she calls RAIN, and it's a way of working with our difficult reactions, but instead of noticing and letting go, we engage with them in a more direct manner. The acronym RAIN stands for R, recognize what's happening. A, allow it to be just as it is. I, investigate with curious attention. This form of investigation is not so much a cognitive exercise. It's meant to bring our awareness to what's actually happening in our body, becoming curious about the feelings and sensations that arise. For instance, we might ask, what needs the most attention right now? What is the texture and quality of that longing? And then we turn to the N of nurture. Nurture with loving presence. After we've recognized, allowed, and investigated, we can then ask the question, what is most needed right now? What's the most compassionate next step to bring to myself, to bring to the situation? How can I best care for myself given the circumstances? While these steps have a natural progression and work well in sequence, sometimes things are just too difficult, and after we recognize and allow, we may need to jump right to nurture. Remember, this is about healing, not forcing yourself to endure the pain. We all have parts of ourselves that can be quite critical and push us to achieve a desired outcome, and it's important to recognize those as well. And that brings me to the next model that I find useful, and it's called Internal Family Systems Therapy, or IFS for short. It comes from Western psychology, but I find it blends remarkably well with Buddhism. In fact, it bears a striking resemblance to some Tibetan practices of Chud, also called feeding your demons, and Vajrayana Maitri, or esoteric loving kindness. Some contemporary meditation teachers are now incorporating IFS into their work with students. IFS is based on the theory of mind that we all have internal parts of ourselves, sometimes called subpersonalities or ego states. And these parts have different qualities, hold unique memories, and relate in different ways to other parts in the system. This can all sound pretty crazy until we start to look inside of ourselves. Most of us are familiar with the inner critic or wounded child. And IFS takes these archetypal concepts and fleshes them out into more distinct and unique parts of our being. So just to give a brief overview of the model, there are different types of parts. There are the exiles, and these are the ones that absorb all that's not been fully processed through our system. All that's been too hot to handle, too painful to look at. Like the classic inner child, they're often young and vulnerable. And these are parts that we've sought to push away out of our consciousness so as to not feel the pain that they hold. And then there are the protectors. Those parts that are there to protect us from feeling the buried pain or experiencing something similar again. There are two types of protectors, managers and firefighters. The managers are the parts that we most identify with. Their job is to keep order and control, to keep our lives functioning, meeting our obligations and responsibility, and most importantly, to not allow the exiles to be triggered. Much of the work of the managers is benign, even beneficial, but they can also prevent us from taking risks, exploring creative solutions, or taking advantage of the spontaneous opportunities that may lead to more fulfillment in our lives. They always prefer the safest and most familiar choice. The firefighters jump in when the managers fail to contain the pain or the fear of the exiles. They typically manifest in extreme or sudden behavior, such as addictions of all sorts, anger, shutdown, or suicidal thoughts. They will do whatever it takes to escape the pain. Their aim is to protect and defend, although their actions are most often misguided. And they can create more problems for us. For that reason, we often want to exile the firefighters as well. And it's easy to make judgments about these different types of parts, but according to the model and my experience with it, it's important to recognize that all of these parts have beneficial intent, even if their actions cause us or others harm. When we work to heal the exiles, the protectors are then able to soften their reactivity and take on more harmonious roles. I have found that it is often the most difficult and challenging parts of us that can then transform into our fiercest allies. The firefighters, after all, carry with them a tremendous amount of courage, strength, and energy, and that can be redirected in positive ways. Also central to IFS is the role of the core self or self-energy. This is our natural state of being. At first, it may seem at odds with the no-self teachings of Buddhism, but when we look at the qualities of self-energy, we start to see that it looks a lot like Buddha nature. Qualities of self include calm, caring, compassion, curiosity, courage, connectedness, confidence, clarity, creativity, and also patience, persistence, and presence. Dick Schwartz, the creator of this model, found that when the reactive parts are able to step aside, relax, or to heal, these qualities of self naturally emerge in everyone. And it's this self that's then able to lead and heal the system. I'm reminded of my first Zen teacher, Karen Suna, who taught about the ego as a system, not just as one aspect of ourselves. The way that she put it is that we have an ego operating system and a Buddha operating system. Our task through our practice is not to get rid of the ego, but to shift our identification from the ego operating system to the Buddha operating system. To put it in IFS terms, all of our reactive parts make up the ego operating system. Their sole purpose is to protect the small self from harm. And in this way, they're helpful to our daily lives. However, if they're driven by past fears to the extent that they read our current situations based on past wounding, they're then unable to respond accurately to the present moment. And we find ourselves overwhelmed or overreacting to events in ways that sometimes mystify us. So how can we use this in our practice? Well, you can start with Reede and just expand on that. So we can first set aside some time to create a safe and comfortable place to do the work, and then begin. Recognize what's happening. How am I reacting? Allow it to be there and locate that experience in or around our bodies. Investigate. Get curious about the qualities of this experience. Does it have a shape or a texture? Can you see an image of it in your mind's eye? Can you create some space between you and this part? And how do you feel towards it? Can you generate some compassion and openness? Or are you judging it harshly? And if so, look to see if there's another part or parts that the judgment is coming from. Is that judging part willing to step aside or relax while we return our attention to the first part? When we can generate some openness and compassion towards the part, you can ask it if it's willing to tell you about itself, and then set aside some time to have a conversation and practice listening deeply as you would to a dear friend, not trying to figure things out, shape the conversation, or to fix anything. Sometimes this conversation can last a long time. Sometimes it can be very short. Sometimes the part will communicate only through images or memories. And sometimes parts don't want to say anything at all. If this is the case, just be patient and continue to create the opportunity to connect. Many of these parts have been silenced for so long that they don't have the trust in anyone, including you, to truly listen to them. Just know that they're showing up in your life because they want to be healed. So after you've listened to their story, ask them what they most need from you right now and offer them some nurturing. You can even incorporate some loving kindness meditation or Tonglen into this stage of the process. When you feel the interaction is complete, thank your parts for showing up and return to your daily activities. For this practice to have lasting effect, it's good to make a commitment to continue to be in relationship with your parts. In my experience, it's not hard to do this. Once you make contact and realize their presence in your system, they'll let you know when they want your attention. And if you can set aside time to be with them and listen to their concerns, they're much less likely to be disruptive in your life. Sometimes this can be a joyful process, and sometimes it can be painful and difficult. Go only as far as you feel comfortable. Be patient with yourself. Stop when you need to, and seek help if you feel that's necessary. This is especially true if you have a history of trauma. Then it's best to do this work with a trained professional. So there's a lot, if you want to learn more about this process, this is just kind of an open, a basic understanding. It gets more complicated, but there's a lot of information online, and there's some other meditation teachers. I know Locke Kelly incorporates this into his teaching, and Ralph De La Rosa, he has this book, The Monkey is the Messenger, which also talks about IFS, and he has a lot of guided meditations online. I know he's got some on Insight Timer, I think also on the Shambhala Publications website. So there's a lot of resources if you want to look into it. So what I love about this model is that, like Buddhism, it's a radically non-pathologizing approach. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, it asks what happened to you. What experience still needs to be processed and integrated, and what needs to be released. And also, like Buddhism, it recognizes that there's an essential nature to our being that's not damaged, cannot be harmed, and can be a source of great empowerment, leadership, and healing for ourselves and others. When we do this work, we realize that everything is relational. We see the same dynamics play out in the outer world as we do within ourselves. In fact, when we look deeply, we can find that some of our parts carry what are called legacy burdens. Legacy burdens are beliefs that we absorb through our families, communities, and culture. These are core beliefs about the way the world works, and we usually don't question them. In fact, we don't often realize that they're even there because they're like the air that we breathe. But they can have a profound effect on the way that we navigate through our lives and how we respond to others. We can fall into the trap of thinking that there's inner work and work that we do in the world, that our practice and our life are different things. But all of the teachings actually tell us otherwise. In the Vimalakirti Sutta, one of the great Mahayana teachings on non-duality, The bodhisattva Vimalakirti transforms himself into a layman who's sick and bedridden. Because of this, the Buddha asks all the other bodhisattvas to go visit him, to inquire about his condition. When Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, arrives, he asks, "How did you get sick? How long will this last? And how can this illness be alleviated?" He's just like us, he wants to know, how did this happen? How long do I have to put up with this, and how can I get rid of it? But Vimalakirti replies, he said, "I'm sick because the world is sick. The world consists only of living beings. Were all living beings to be free from sickness, I would also not be sick." His condition is a reflection of his deep compassion and his realization that he, even as a great and wise bodhisattva, is not separate from all other beings. I once read a quote, and I don't remember the source. It's, I'm sure, from a Buddhist text, but it said something like, all the world's problems could be solved if we were only to divest ourselves of the belief in a separate self. And this has stayed with me as something of another koan. It's a bold statement, and I hold it up to when I see all the complex problems in the world, to see if it's really true. And so far, it seems to be. Nearly every conflict comes down to I, me, mine, or us versus them, including how we interact with the non-human world. This is the sickness that Vimalakirti is talking about, our great delusion that causes so much suffering. The world is sick because we are sick. And therefore, the work of healing ourselves, in whatever form that takes, is bodhisattva activity. But sometimes we need to get off the cushion and go into our daily lives, engage in the activities of the world to encounter the other, who will show us through their actions and our reactions to them, the places in us that still need our attention. Because the whole phenomenal world is the Dharmakaya, the body of the Buddha, and we are the parts that reside within that whole body. When we do the difficult work of becoming intimate with all of our inner parts, especially the ones we're embarrassed of or don't want to acknowledge, the ones that may still carry offensive beliefs that were absorbed subconsciously from our families or our culture, or the ones that carry such deep pain that we feel will consume us. If we can do this within ourselves, we're much more able to meet the so-called outer enemies with recognition and compassion, even if we never agree on the same course of action. We're also much more likely to continue whatever work we're called to do in the world, motivated by love and compassion instead of fear and aversion, even in dark and confusing times, knowing that we're just one of many who will continue this work until all beings are free. After all, that's the bodhisattva vow that we take. Beings are numberless. Suffering is endless. Delusions are inexhaustible. So we just take one step at a time. So what is true healing? Well, I'm still working on that, and I'm still sitting with that. But as a wise friend recently said to me, I'm not really interested in the answers. It's the question that intrigues me. But Tara Brach has a good answer, and so I think I'll share that with you. She says, healing is a process of coming home to the truth and fullness of who we are. And so I think that's a pretty good answer, and it's a good place to end. So I just want to open that up to conversation, questions, comments, and whatever else you have to share.